Hello World News Economic, starting with the Joker chart. Words are starting to fail me to describe the horror of this chart now. I once made a graphic showing the fact that it might go off the chart at about -4%, but how can you really say in reality whether you believed this or not? You just can't say this. I certainly never really believed it could possibly end up this bad. You can see all the other recessions since the Second World War and how, besides the brown one, the 2001 recession, they'd all finished by now, and there is, to say the least, no end in sight at all for the unemployment recession that is still pertaining in the United States. It is an utter horror show. To represent this again, because I don't think it can be over-represented, this is the M ratio taken from the St. Louis Fed, civilian employment to population ratio, going back to the late 40s. And you can see so many people came into the workforce from as a percentage of the population, with mainly women coming into the workforce, and it peaked there at the peak of the dot-com bubble, and since it has been an enormous great falling off, and now it's down to a level which was first attained in the mid-70s. Next one, just to show that drop-off in a slightly different way, because as I say, I don't think it can be over-emphasized. This just going back 20 years, and how everything seemed good with the advent of computers and productivity going up into that dot-com boom, and then since then, for the last 10 years, it has been nothing but downhill, and now bumping along a very, very low ratio. And why would it ever go up again? Can you know anything that would make it go up again? That means this is structural unemployment across the board. Barry Ritholtz at the big picture has been absolutely rock solid for as long as I've been looking at his site for the last 4 years or so. Rock solid through all of this. His article here, "Don't Drink, Don't Smoke, What Do You Do?" is a cry of frustration. Markets are reacting to the surprising NFP disappointment of 18K. That's the unemployment print that made for the Joker chart. Surprising really to whom? And later in the article he lets it rip. Consider the various players and how they have painted themselves into a corner. The big players, the influential movers and shakers. The Federal Reserve has lost much credibility for helping to cause the crisis, for the bailout of Bear Stearns, for sending inflation higher, for the crumbling dollar. If we're being fair, they should get kudos for reliquefying the system during the crisis, nod. But they, under increasing pressure, face possible audits and other threats to their independence. After QE1, QE2 and now QE 2.5, the rolling over in already invested paper, there is no appetite for another round of Fed easing. Congress, the legislative body in charge of taxing and spending, seems comfortable with their hardened partisan positions and few accomplishments. Indeed, as the LA Times has noted, the 112th Congress is one of the least productive in decades. Job creation is not going to come out of anything that Congress does. We are more likely to see counterproductive austerity measures based on the experience of Great Britain, Portugal and Ireland. Not good examples. The GOP. I have consistently criticised the Republicans for A. magical thinking despite proof otherwise, B. hypocrisy in creating the deficit under Bush but crying about it under Obama, and not interested in anything in terms of jobs. We've done the GOP, we go on to the Democrats. Their inept, uninformed understanding of economics, messaging, and markets is beyond my comprehension. Austin Goolsbee being one of the rare exceptions, apparently incapable of anything involving jobs. Obama himself needs to figure out what his economic plan is, how to interact with the GOP, and whether he will abandon his base. His hands and brain seem to be completely tied when it comes to anything involving jobs. Given that historical backdrop and the major players tied up in knots, it is hard to see how the job picture will improve anytime soon. Now, you can have your debate how much the government should stay out of the economy, and then everything will cure itself, but I will then say, grow up. They've been in the economy since the 20s, and they're going to stay in the economy. So it's better that if they're going to stay in the economy, that they do things that will improve the job situation. Barry Einhorn has also been rock solid through and the run-up to this crisis. Greenlight, his hedge fund. His letter to investors gives us this picture. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. We'll come to that later. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. He writes, lightly, the real worry is that the first default will expose the fiction that sovereign debt is risk-free. We've kind of moved to Europe, but this is a huge macro concept that is of absolute, incredible macro importance to the entire financial system. The fact that sovereign debt is the baseline for judging the riskiness of other debt, on the understanding that the sovereign debt is baseline zero safe. Likely the real worry is that the first default will expose the fiction that sovereign debt is risk-free. And as soon as that happens, all the models that have developed over the last 25 years will all be thrown out because they're all predicated on the sovereign debt being safe. If the authorities permit one default, their credibility to prevent additional defaults will be lost. No one knows just how much aggregate exposure to sovereign debt and CDS is hidden in the banking system, and no one is itching to find out. Just that is criminal in its own way, that Barry Einhorn, with unlimited money at his disposal, can't find out what is hidden in the banking system, and seemingly the authorities don't want to find out either. He wants to find out, but can't. The authorities could find out, probably, but won't. The European regulators are trying to calm the market by conducting stress tests on the banks. This might be more comforting if the stress tests including testing for the possibility of a sovereign default. They do not. What is the point of a stress test that fails to test for the most obvious and visible risk facing banks? He goes on. Meanwhile, the charade continues, with the banks agreeing to volunteer to roll over their debt. Next up was a conversation with the rating agencies. We know they haven't been up to scratch, the rating agencies. When asked to opine as to whether the voluntary rollover would be considered a default, the rating agencies initially indicated that if it looked like a default, they would label it as such, trying to get up to speed. It was at this point that German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble suggested that now might be a good time to break up the credit rating agency oligopoly, et voilà. The rating agencies are presently reconsidering their view that the voluntary rollover of the Greek debt would, in fact, be counted as a default. The ECB appears to be counting on at least one agency to cave in to the pressure, having previously lowered its standard to accept Greek paper as collateral despite it being below investment grade. The ECB now says it will accept Greek paper as long as even just one of the 3 rating agencies doesn't consider a restructuring as a default. I talked about that a couple of days ago. As Magritte, the artist of the pipe picture, might say, this is not a default, just try to collect on your credit default swaps. What Magritte was trying to indicate, saying ceci n'est pas une pipe, this is not a pipe, is in you can't stuff tobacco in it and smoke it. It's just a representation of a pipe. And what we have here is this is not a default. You're not going to get paid out because this is just a representation of a default. It's all illusion. And that ain't no way to run a world. See you tomorrow.